The morning fog had not yet lifted off the Chesapeake Bay when Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Voss parked her truck in the lot outside the Harborview Veterans Assistance Center in Crisfield, Maryland. It was a Tuesday in early October, the kind of morning where the air smells like salt and old wood, and something that might be rain. She sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, not because she needed to collect herself. Elena Voss had been collecting herself in quiet moments like this for 22 years, but because she always liked to take one breath before she walked into a place where people expected things from her. She was 44 years old. She had spent more than 2 decades in the United States Navy. She had deployed to the Persian Gulf 3 times, served aboard the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower as a logistics chief, spent 14 months in a joint operations role advising Navy Special Warfare Units in Djibouti, and had been awarded the Navy Commendation Medal with a Combat Distinguishing Device, one of only a handful of women in her rate to receive that distinction in the field. She had also buried 2 of her sailors after a vehicle accident in Bahrain in 2014, written letters to their mothers, and stood at both funerals in her dress uniform without letting herself cry until she was alone in her hotel room at 2 in the morning. She was not the kind of woman who needed people to know any of that. That was part of the problem. Elena stepped out of the truck. She was wearing civilian clothes, dark slacks, a plain navy blouse, comfortable shoes. She had retired from active duty 14 months ago, and she still had not fully adjusted to not wearing a uniform, not because she missed the authority of it. She had never been someone who needed rank to feel important. She missed it because the uniform said something without her having to say it. It told the story before she had to open her mouth. In civilian clothes, in a small town on the eastern shore of Maryland, where she had moved to care for her aging mother, Elena Voss was just a quiet middle-aged woman with short-cropped grey-brown hair and a way of standing very still when she listened to you. Most people in Crisfield had no idea who she was. Most of them had made up their minds about her in other ways. The Harborview Veterans Assistance Center was a converted hardware store that smelled faintly of sawdust under the industrial cleaner. There were folding tables arranged in rows, a coffee station along the back wall, and a bulletin board covered in flyers about disability claims, job fairs, and mental health resources. Elena had been volunteering here for 9 months, helping veterans navigate paperwork, benefits claims, and the confusing tangle of transitioning out of military service. It was work she believed in. It was also work that had brought her into close and regular contact with a man named Gerald Hofstede. Gerald Hofstede was the center's regional director. He was 58 years old, had a broad pink face, and had served 4 years in the Army National Guard in the early 1990s without deploying anywhere. He wore his service like a medal he had polished himself. He called everyone by their first name except himself. He preferred to be addressed as Director Hofstede, or sometimes just Director, in a tone that suggested he had given considerable thought to the title. Gerald Hofstede did not care for Elena Voss. It had started small, the way these things always do. In her first week, she had quietly corrected a procedural error in the way the center was processing dependency and indemnity compensation claims for surviving spouses, a mistake that had been causing delays of 2 to 3 months for widows who were trying to access survivor benefits. She had not made a big deal of it. She had simply left a typed note on his desk with the correct VA form numbers and the relevant policy references. He had thanked her in a tone that did not sound like gratitude. Over the following months, the veterans who came through the center had started requesting Elena specifically. Word had spread, quietly, the way word always spreads in small towns, that there was a woman at Harborview who actually knew what she was talking about, who had been there, who would sit with you for 2 hours if that's what it took, and who would not let you leave without understanding exactly what you were entitled to and exactly how to ask for it. Gerald Hofstede noticed, and he did not like it. On the morning in question, that Tuesday in October with the bay fog and the salt smell, Elena walked into the center to find it busier than usual. There was a community benefits fair being held, and the room had been rearranged to accommodate additional tables and a small raised platform at the front where a local official would be speaking. Several people from town had come in, including some who were not veterans themselves, but had family members who were. There were folding chairs arranged in a half-circle, and a handful of men from the county commissioner's office stood near the coffee table looking official in their sport coats. Elena found her usual table, set down her folder of documents and got to work. Within 20 minutes there was a line. She was helping a retired Marine corporal named Dwight Bauer, 71 years old, Vietnam era, dealing with a hearing loss claim that had been denied 3 times, when she became aware that Gerald Hofstede had walked up and was standing slightly behind her. She could tell from the sound of his footsteps and from the way Dwight's eyes flicked to something over her shoulder. She turned. Hofstede was standing with 2 men she did not recognize. One was in his mid-40s, wearing a county commissioner's lanyard. The other was older, perhaps late 60s, in a neat blazer, with the bearing of someone who had once been important and had not forgotten it. He was introduced, she would learn a moment later, as Councilman Robert Farley, who chaired the county's Veteran Affairs Subcommittee and had driven out from Salisbury for the fair. And this, Hofstede said, with a gesture toward Alina that managed to be both dismissive and performative at the same time, is one of our volunteers. Alina, she helps with the paperwork side of things. Alina straightened, she smiled politely at the councilman and extended her hand. Alina Voss, good to meet you. Councilman Farley shook her hand. He had the comfortable grip of someone who shook a lot of hands. Alina, you a veteran yourself? Yes, sir, she said, Navy, 22 years. Farley nodded with the slightly detached interest of a man who was processing the answer while already thinking about the next thing. Good, good. And what was your— He glanced at Hofstede, then back. What did you do in the Navy? Were you what admin, support? Logistics originally, Alina said. I worked up to Master Chief. My last posting was in an advisory capacity with Naval Special Warfare. Something shifted in Farley's expression, not dramatically, just a small recalibration. Naval Special Warfare, he repeated. That's the SEAL teams. Adjacent, she said simply. Hofstede, who had been listening to this exchange with a tightening around his jaw, chose that moment to insert himself. He laughed, a soft, easy laugh, the kind that is designed to make whatever follows sound like harmless humor. Logistics, he said, turning slightly to include the commissioner in his audience. So basically inventory management, right, Alina? He smiled at her with his whole face except his eyes. I mean, no offense, important work, someone's got to count the supplies. He gave a little chuckle. The commissioner smiled faintly, uncertain. Alina looked at Gerald Hofstede for a moment, just a moment. Someone does, she said. And she turned back to Dwight Bauer and his hearing claim. But Hofstede was not finished. He had an audience and he had built to something, and he was not the kind of man who walked away from a setup without landing the joke. He said with a brightness that was almost cheerful, so what's your rank anyway, in the volunteers here? Are you what? He made a small gesture, a private, a corporal. He laughed again, glancing at the commissioner. The room had gone slightly quiet. Not completely, there was still the background noise of the fair, people at other tables, the coffee machine. But the people nearby had noticed. Dwight Bauer, the 71-year-old Marine, had gone very still. Alina set down her pen. She turned around fully and looked at Gerald Hofstede. She spoke in a voice that was calm and quiet and completely level. Master Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, retired, she said. E9, 22 years of service, 3 combat deployments. I've been attached to joint task forces in 4 countries and I've held a top secret clearance for 16 years. She paused. Would you like me to keep going? There was a silence. Councilman Farley was looking at her with an entirely different expression than he'd had 30 seconds ago. Hofstede's smile had not disappeared, but it had shifted into something that no longer resembled enjoyment. I was just— he started. I know, Alina said. She picked up her pen and turned back to Dwight. Mr. Bauer, let's talk about the audiologist report. I think the denial was based on an incomplete medical nexus statement, and we can fix that. Dwight Bauer looked at her for a second. Then he looked at Gerald Hofstede. Then he looked back at Alina. And in his eyes, those old, watery eyes of a man who had seen things in the Mekong Delta that he never talked about, there was something quiet and clear that might have been recognition. Yes, ma'am, Dwight said. Alina drove home that evening on the 2-lane road that ran along the edge of the marsh, with the last light going orange over the water and the egrets standing in the shallows like white commas. She did not spend a lot of time thinking about Gerald Hofstede. She had met Gerald Hofstede, or versions of him, many times in her life, in many different uniforms and many different roles. Men who made you smaller in rooms so that they could feel larger. It was an old story. She was too tired for it to wound her the way it might have once. What she thought about instead was Dwight Bauer. She had spent 2 hours with him after the fair crowd thinned. She had gone through his medical records, his service documentation, his denial letters. The VA had rejected his hearing loss claim 3 times on the grounds of insufficient evidence linking his current condition to his military service, even though the man had served as a mortarman in Vietnam and had been in close proximity to artillery fire for 14 months. The logic was maddening. The paperwork was a maze. But Alina had navigated worse mazes, and by the time they were done, she had drafted a new claims statement, identified a buddy statement from a fellow veteran who had served alongside Dwight and could corroborate the noise exposure, and outlined exactly what Dwight needed to bring to his next VA appointment. When they had finished, Dwight had looked at the stack of papers on the table and then at Alina, and he had said very quietly, "You know, I've been trying to get this for 11 years. "I know," she said. "My wife," he started and then stopped. He looked at his hands. "She passed in March. She always said we'd get it figured out. She had more faith in the system than I did." Alina had said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Then let's get it figured out, for her." Dwight had nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. This was why Alina Voss had come to Crisfield. Not for Gerald Hofstede. Not for the community fairs or the county commissioners or the politics of small-town veteran services. She had come to take care of her mother, yes, her mother, Margaret, who was 81 and had a bad hip and a good mind, and lived in the same house Alina had grown up in, the white clapboard house on Elm Street with the garden that had gotten a little overgrown since Alina's father passed. But she had stayed and she had found the centre because this was the work. This was what she had always done, looked after people, fought for them, made sure they got what they were owed. The Navy had given her a lot of things. It had given her structure when she was 22 and adrift. It had given her a purpose and a framework and a community. It had also, over 22 years, given her an unflinching clarity about what mattered and what didn't. Gerald Hofstede's little performance at the benefits fair mattered less than the dust on the parking lot. Dwight Bauer's 11-year fight with the VA mattered very, very much. She turned into the driveway of the white clapboard house. The porch light was on. Through the front window, she could see the blue flicker of the television. Inside, her mother was in her armchair with a blanket over her lap and a cup of tea on the end table, watching the evening news with the sound turned up a little too loud. She turned when Alina came in. "How was it?" Margaret asked. "Fine," Alina said. She set down her bag and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. "Busy, good turnout." "That Hofstede man give you any trouble?" Alina looked out the kitchen window at the dark yard. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Margaret made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. "You know, your father used to say the same thing, every single time. Nothing I couldn't handle. Came home one night with 3 stitches in his hand and said, 'Nothing I couldn't handle.'" Alina smiled. She brought 2 mugs to the living room and sat on the couch, and for a little while they didn't talk, just watched the news together in the blue light. And Alina thought about Dwight Bauer, and about the buddy statement they needed to track down, and about the specific language she should use in the new Nexus statement, and about the way Hofstede had laughed when he said the word inventory. She was not angry. Anger was a fuel she had learned to use carefully in small doses for things that were worth it. What she was, if she was being honest with herself, was tired of being underestimated. Not because it hurt her, she had built a life that was largely proof against that particular injury, but because when people underestimated her, they underestimated the work. And the work mattered. Dwight Bauer mattered. She wrapped both hands around her mug of tea and let the warmth come through. Outside, the marsh was dark and quiet, and somewhere across the water a light was moving, a boat heading home, probably making its way through the fog. The thing about small towns is that news moves differently there than anywhere else. It doesn't travel through formal channels or official statements. It travels through conversations at the post office and remarks made over the deli counter at the grocery store and observations exchanged at the diner on Main Street, where the coffee is served in white ceramic mugs that have been there since the 1980s. By the following Friday, most of Crisfield had heard some version of what had happened at the benefits fair, though the version that was travelling was not, precisely, what had happened. The version that Gerald Hofstede had told to the commissioner's aide, to a couple of board members of the centre, to the woman who ran the ladies' auxiliary chapter he attended, was that Alina Voss had been unprofessional at the fair, that she had spoken inappropriately to him in front of guests, that she had been aggressive. He didn't use that word directly. He used it the way people use it when they want the idea without the accountability. He said she had made things uncomfortable. He said she had a difficult personality. He said he was starting to wonder if the volunteer arrangement was working out. Elena heard none of this directly. She heard it the way you hear things in small towns, sideways. A glance held a second too long. A conversation at the centre that stopped when she walked in. A phone call from Patris, the centre's administrative coordinator, who had the uncomfortable, slightly flushed look of someone delivering a warning they had not asked to deliver. "He's talking about restructuring the volunteer program," Patris said. They were in the small back office, the door half closed. Patris was 40, practical, kind, and very aware of which way the wind was blowing. "I don't know the details, but he mentioned something about clearer role definitions and appropriate boundaries for volunteers." Elena nodded. "Does he have the authority to end volunteer agreements?" "Technically, yes," Patris said. She hesitated. "Elena, I want you to know the veterans they notice. Dwight was in here Monday telling anyone who'd listen what you did for him. And there are others." "I know," Elena said. Patris stopped. She was trying to say something kind without overpromising anything. "I just didn't want you to be blindsided." "Thank you," Elena said. "I appreciate that." She was not blindsided. She had not been blindsided by anything in a long time. But she was aware, with a quiet and careful clarity, that what was happening now had moved past a petty comment at a community fair. This was the beginning of something organized, something that would need to be dealt with not through silence or patience, but through something more intentional. She went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop and a notepad, and she began to write. Not a complaint, not yet. She began with documentation, dates, times, direct quotes where she had them, descriptions of interactions where she didn't. She had learned this in the Navy, when something is going wrong in an institution. You write it down clearly, without emotion, without editorializing. You create a record. The record is your protection. The record is your voice when you are in a room full of people who do not want to hear you. Her mother came to the kitchen doorway at 9:30. "You coming to bed?" "In a bit," Elena said. Margaret looked at the notepad and the laptop and her daughter's still, focused face. She had seen that face before. She had seen it on the morning Elena left for boot camp at 22, and she had seen it in the months after the accident in Bahrain, and she had seen it every time Elena was in the middle of something that required her to be more than most people could manage. "Don't let it take too much out of you," Margaret said. Elena looked up. "I won't. Your father used to say." "Nothing I couldn't handle," Elena said. Margaret smiled. "That's right." She turned back to the hallway. "Good night, baby." "Good night, Mom." Elena looked down at her notepad. Outside, the October wind was moving through the yard, and the garden was quiet. And somewhere in the dark, the Chesapeake was doing what it had always done, moving slowly toward the sea. There is a particular kind of isolation that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who have decided something about you. Elena had known this kind before. On her second deployment, she had been the only woman in a forward logistics cell of 17 sailors, and 3 of them had made it quietly clear, through 100 small signals and exclusions, that they thought she had no business being there. She had handled it the same way she handled most things, by doing her job better than anyone expected, and by never giving those 3 men the satisfaction of knowing they had gotten to her. She handled Crisfield the same way. Through October and into November, she came to the centre 3 days a week and did her work. She did not make scenes. She did not engage with Hofstede's passive manoeuvres except to document them carefully in the notepad at home. When he scheduled a volunteer orientation meeting that everyone else at the centre knew about and she was not informed of, she noted it and said nothing. When a letter went out to the County Veteran Affairs Subcommittee, she saw a copy on the copier, left carelessly face up, probably not accidentally, describing the volunteer programs, areas for improvement, in language that clearly gestured at her without namming her. She photographed it with her phone and added it to her file. She also kept helping veterans. She helped a Gulf War veteran named Clarence with his toxic exposure claim. She helped a young woman named Kaya, 26, Iraq-era Army, dealing with an MSD-related PTSD claim that the VA had been slow-walking through the appeals process, sitting with her for 3 sessions and sometimes just letting Kaya talk without trying to fix anything, because sometimes that was what was needed. She helped an 83-year-old Korean War veteran named Harold secure a pension that he had not known he was entitled to. And she was there the afternoon the letter came in saying it had been approved, when Harold sat down in one of the folding chairs and covered his face with both hands and said quietly, "Lord have mercy." These things she did not document, these things were simply the work. In mid-November, two things happened. The first was that Dwight Bauer received a letter from the VA approving his hearing loss claim. Full service connection, retroactive to the date of his original claim 11 years ago, which meant a significant back payment. He came into the center on a Thursday morning with the letter in his hand and found Alina at her table and stood there for a moment without saying anything, and Alina could see that he was working hard to hold himself together. "My wife would have," he started. "I know," Alina said. He sat down, he put the letter on the table between them. They both looked at it. 11 years, he said. "Yeah," she said. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. He looked at Alina. "Thank you," he said. "I mean it, thank you." "You did the work," she said. "I just helped you see the path." He looked at her for another moment, then he said something she did not expect. "I know what Hofstede's been saying about you. I've lived in this town 40 years, I know how it moves." He paused. "There are people who know better." Alina said nothing. "That's all I'm saying," Dwight said. The second thing that happened in mid-November was that Councilman Robert Farley called the center and asked, specifically, if Alina Voss would be available to meet with him the following week. He was putting together a subcommittee report on veteran services gaps in the lower shore counties and wanted to include her perspective. Gerald Hofstede, who took the call, told the councilman's office that he would check on her availability. He did not check. He did not mention the call to Alina. Alina found out about it from Patris, who had been CC'd on the follow-up email. She responded to the councilman's office directly. The meeting was held in Salisbury, in a conference room at the county building, on a Wednesday afternoon. Farley was there with 2 aides. Alina came in civilian clothes, with a folder containing organized notes on the systemic gaps she had observed in veteran services across the region, claim processing bottlenecks, geographic barriers to VA facilities, specific populations being underserved, practical recommendations drawn from 9 months of frontline work. Farley remembered her from the benefits fair. She could see it in the way he looked at her when she sat down, the same recalibration she had seen that morning, but now without any of the initial ambiguity. He had done some homework. "Master Chief Voss," he said. "Just Alina is fine," she said. "Alina," he opened his folder. "I've been told you have some observations about how the center at Crisfield is operating." "I have observations about veteran services generally in this region," she said carefully. "I'm happy to share those." "And specifically," Farley said, watching her with the practiced eye of a man who had been in local politics for 20 years and had developed a considerable sensitivity to the things people were choosing not to say, about the center. Alina looked at him for a moment. She had her documentation folder with her. She set it on the table. "I'll share what I think is relevant to your report," she said. "The rest I'd rather handle through the appropriate channels." Farley nodded slowly. "Gerald Hofstede," he said, in a tone that suggested this was not the first time the name had come up in this context, "has been regional director for 4 years. In that time I'm aware that we have had," he paused, "some turnover in the volunteer and staff positions at that center." "I'm aware of that too," Alina said. Farley looked at his aide. The aide looked at his notepad. "Tell me what you know," Farley said to Alina, informally, just between us. And Alina, who had been patient for long enough, and who had a folder full of documented facts and not a single editorialized sentence in it, told him. She did not perform outrage. She did not dramatize. She laid out what she had observed with dates and specifics, in the same tone she would have used to brief a commanding officer on a logistics discrepancy, clear, organized, precise. She talked about the systemic impacts, veterans who had gone without help because the process had been misdirected, claims that had languished, appointments she had tried to flag that had been dismissed. She talked about Kaya, without using her name, and about what it meant for a young woman with an MSD claim to walk into a center and find someone who took her seriously. She talked about Dwight Bauer's 11 years. When she was done, Farley sat quietly for a moment. "Why didn't you report this sooner?" he asked. "I wanted to be sure," she said, "and I wanted to give it a chance to correct itself." "And it didn't." "No," she said, "it didn't." Farley looked at the folder. "Can I have copies of this documentation?" You can have the originals, Elena said. I kept copies. He almost smiled. Of course you did. What followed was not dramatic. Real accountability rarely is. It unfolds slowly, through meetings and phone calls and bureaucratic processes that are invisible to most people and feel, from the inside, agonizingly slow. There was a formal review. There was an internal investigation by the state-level Veterans Services Organization that oversaw the center's funding. Hofstede was not fired immediately. These things never happen immediately, but he was placed on administrative review, and a temporary interim director was appointed while the process moved forward. Elena continued to come to the center 3 days a week. The first week of December, she arrived on a Tuesday morning to find Clarence waiting by the door in his army field jacket, with a thermos of coffee and a paper bag from the diner. "Brought you breakfast," he said. She looked at the bag. "Clarence, you didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't have to," he said. He held the door open for her. "That's why I did it." Inside there were others. Kaya was there earlier than usual. Harold was there with his wife, who had driven him in from the country and who shook Elena's hand with both of hers and said, "You changed our lives." There were 6 others, men and women, who had been coming to the center for months, who had quietly noticed, and who had quietly decided to show up today in the way that people in small towns show up when something matters. Patris was standing by the coffee table with slightly red eyes. "What's going on?" Elena asked. "Nothing," Patris said, "just Tuesday." Elena looked at the room full of people. She looked at the paper bag in her hand. She looked at Dwight Bauer, who had come in behind her and was now standing by the window with his hands in his pockets and a small, private expression on his face. She set down her bag and her folder. She went to her table. She sat down. "All right," she said. "Who needs help today?" In early January, Councilman Farley's subcommittee report was submitted to the county board. It included a section, 9 pages long, on the systemic gaps in veteran services in the lower Shore counties. It cited specifically the model of individualized claims support that had developed organically at the Crisfield Center over the past year. It recommended formally that the county fund a permanent position for a veteran services specialist at the Crisfield location. The report did not mention Elena by name. She had asked that it not. But it mentioned the work. A week after the report was released, Elena received a phone call from a number she did not recognize. She answered it on the 3rd ring, standing in the kitchen while the kettle was heating on the stove. "Is this Elena Voss?" a man's voice, older, crisp. "Speaking." "Elena, my name is James Calloway. I'm a retired Rear Admiral, Naval Special Warfare Command. I'm currently on the board of a Veteran Services non-profit out of Annapolis. Councilman Farley's report came across my desk this week." A pause. "I understand you were the primary point of contact for the analysis that informed the recommendations." The kettle began to whistle. Elena reached over and turned off the burner. "I contributed some documentation," she said. A sound on the other end that might have been appreciation, or might have been amusement at her precision. "I also understand you served with Naval Special Warfare in an advisory capacity. I'm trying to understand why I don't know your name." "I wasn't the type to make a lot of noise, sir," she said. "I'm beginning to see that." Another pause. "We have a regional director position opening in the spring, for veteran services coordination across the lower and mid-shore counties. It would involve oversight of multiple centers, community outreach, working with county and state agencies." He paused again. "I'm told you have some experience with all of those things." Elena stood in her kitchen with the quiet phone and the quiet house and the winter light coming through the window over the sink. Outside, the garden was dormant under a light frost, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something, and the world was going about its ordinary business. She thought about Dwight Bauer's 11 years. She thought about Kaya. She thought about Harold covering his face with both hands. She thought about her father, who had handled things that needed handling without ever needing anyone to know about it. She thought about her mother in the armchair with her tea, telling her not to let it take too much out of her. She thought about Gerald Hofstede saying inventory management with a laugh, and the way the room had gone quiet, and the way Dwight had looked at her afterward. "I might," she said to the Admiral, "tell me more about the position." The day Admiral Calloway came to Crisfield, he insisted on it, said he preferred to meet in the field, a habit he'd kept from 30 years of operational command, was a grey Wednesday in February with a light snow falling over the marsh. He drove himself, which surprised her. He was 67, still carrying himself with the upright economy of a man who had never quite left the Navy, but with a warmth in his face that suggested he had made peace with most things. They met at the centre. Elena had arranged for them to have the back conference room, which was small and had one window and a folding table and 4 chairs. She had a pot of coffee ready. When she showed him in, he stopped at the doorway and looked at the main room, at the tables and the veterans, and the stacks of paperwork and the bulletin board. He stood there for a moment without saying anything.